Good evening. I'm David Kataforis, Professor and Chair of Art History at the University of Kansas. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Kansas resides on the ancestral territory of the Kaw people, who were forced off their land by the United States in the 19th century and largely relocated to Oklahoma. This acknowledgement recognizes Native Americans as traditional guardians of the land and the enduring relationship between Native peoples and these traditional territories. I'm pleased to welcome you to another lecture in our ongoing series, Intersections of Identity, Expression, Exchange, and Hybridity. The series asks, what constitutes identity? How do people navigate, form, and reform their sense of self? And how can the study of art and its history help us to consider the diverse identities expressed by visual culture and its creators? We seek to amplify the voices of scholars and artists whose work explores individual and collective identities as those intersect with notions of the body, disability, gender, heritage, and race. The series is organized by KU's Crest Foundation Department of Art History and the graduate students of the History of Art, Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee. It is sponsored by the Franklin Murphy Lecture Fund. We present it in partnership with the Spencer Museum of Art and the KU Department of Visual Art. The graduate students and I are grateful to Art History Department Office Manager Lisa Clore for all of her organizational help. It's my honor to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Atreyee Gupta, who is Assistant Professor in the History of Art Department at the University of California, Berkeley. She earned her BA from Maharaja Sajarajaya University, Baroda, Vadodara in India, and her PhD from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Gupta's area of expertise is global modernism, with an emphasis on the aesthetic and intellectual flows that have cut across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America from the 20th century onwards. Her research and teaching interests cluster around visual and intellectual histories of 20th century art, the intersections among the Cold War, the non-aligned movement, and art after 1945, new media and experimental cinema, and the question of the global as materially, intellectually, and politically constellated around decolonization. Dr. Gupta is presently completing Non-Aligned, Decolonization, Modernism, and the Third World Project, India, circa 1930 to 1960, a book on the artistic and intellectual resonances of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War era and the interwar anti-colonial Afro-Asian networks that preceded it. Her co-edited books include Post-War, A Global Art History, 1945 to 1965, with Okwe and Wezor. Dr. Gupta has published essays on post-colonial art, the Cold War, and the non-aligned movement in journals such as Art Journal, Issue, and Third Text. Other publications have focused on the methodologies for global art history, the myriad histories of the global, and the question of translation that emerges therein. She has spoken internationally and delivered keynotes at conferences, museums, and nonprofit organizations. Affiliated with the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies, the Institute for South Asia Studies, and the Center for Southeast Asia Studies, and the Center for Race and Gender, Dr. Gupta teaches courses on modern and contemporary Asian and Asian American art and architecture, along with thematic seminars on South and Southeast art, art and decolonization, curatorial practices, and global modernisms more broadly. She also co-founded and co-leads the UC Berkeley South Asia Art Initiative at the Institute for South Asia Studies. Before coming to Berkeley in 2017, Dr. Gupta was the Jane Emison Assistant Curator of South and Southeast Asian Art at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and she's engaged in curatorial projects at UC Berkeley. Dr. Gupta's lecture this evening will be followed by a question and answer moderated by a member of the DEAI committee. So please type your questions for Dr. Gupta into the chat in YouTube, either during or immediately following her talk. I'm now happy to turn the screen over to her for her lecture, Thinking Through Color, F.N. Souza's Black Paintings.
Thank you, David, for your kind introduction. And thank you also to the student organizers of this talk series. I've met some of you virtually, and I can only imagine how much more enriching it would be if we could be there together in person. That said, let me try to share my screen. Does that work?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, I think. Yeah, thank you. All right, so I want to address the theme of the workshop today by thinking through the question of color. And by color, I mean pigment, but also skin. The subject at hand is Francis Newton Souza's black paintings. But I want to begin, though, in 1955 Paris. I was staring at a news item that baffled me, wrote the African-American author and mid-century civil rights activist Richard Wright, who was then based in Paris. He continues, I bent forward and read the item a second time. 29 free and independent nations of Asia and Africa are meeting in Bandung, Indonesia, to discuss racialism and colonialism. What was this? I scanned the list of nations involved. I began a rapid calculation of the population of the nations listed, and when my total topped the billion mark, I stopped, pulled off my glasses, and tried to think. The meeting in question was the gathering of the leaders of newly independent nations from Africa and Asia in Bandung, Indonesia, in the summer of 1955. Wright continues. And what had these nations in common? Nothing, it seems to me, but their past relationship to the Western world. This meeting of the rejected was in itself a kind of judgment upon that Western world. Wright's use of the word judgment in this instance was not entirely misplaced. He intuitively understood the Bandung Conference as a declamation addressed to Western imperialism and its lingering specter that continued to cast a long shadow over substantial parts of the world. The solidarities forged in Bandung eventually led to the formalization of the non-aligned movement under the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Sukarno of Indonesia, Nasser of Egypt, Tito of Yugoslavia, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana at the gathering in Belgrade in 1961. Wright on his part was quick to see beyond the immediate political implications of Bandung. He continues, I called my wife, and when she came into the living room, I said to her, look there, 29 nations of Asia and Africa are meeting in a place called Bandung. Why are they meeting? Read this, I said, giving her the newspaper. Why, that's the human race. Exactly, and that is why I want to go. As an African-American thinker and activist, deeply invested in the post-war civil rights movement in the United States, Wright perceived the Bandung Conference as an event whose vectors exceeded the geopolitical borders of the 29 participating nations. Wright's initial reflections were hardly off the mark. Despite internal tensions, the political multilateralism inaugurated at Bandung rendered a deep fissure in the monopoly of Westernism, not just over the definition of internationalism, but also in the discursive delineation of post-war humanism. The intellectual and artistic vectors of this new humanism of the post-war era demands examination for its resonances, for the practice of art history, and the work of institutional critique within the context of the museum still remains little understood and even lesser theorized. Furthermore, the intersections between non-alignment, which in itself was a facet of decolonization, and art, has proven notoriously difficult to parse out, as artistic representation rarely offers motifs or subject matter that can be directly related back to non-alignment in any simple way. Then, should we say that non-alignment had little to do with artistic practice? Surely not. But the relationship between creative imagination and political process of decolonization was necessarily dialectic. As such, it demanded an active viewership. In the time before us, I want to then take up the invitation of the workshop organizers to extrapolate the intersections between art and non-alignment within the mid-century context of decolonization, in the hope that these may help to illuminate the decolonizing present that we have now inherited and inhabit, a present, I should add, in which the question of race, the question of Du Bois's color line, has returned with seemingly irreconcilable force. We begin then in 1966 in post-imperial London, exactly 5 years after the non-aligned movement was formalized at the second gathering of the newly decolonized countries in Belgrade. In the summer of 1966, a rather peculiar solo exhibition, Black Art and Other Paintings, opened in London's Grosvenor Gallery. The artist in question was Souza, the South Asian artist then based in London, and Souza would relocate to New York merely months after the exhibition opened. No photograph of the 1966 exhibition can be located. However, based on a recent rehang, we can imagine that upon entering the space of the White Cube in 1966, the viewers encountered the artworks, black rectangles of different sizes, as an immersive whole. At face value, the paintings would have seemed austere, abstract, uniform, as indeed they do when compressed into the flatness of the pixels and projection on the screen before us. Seemingly non-representational, they appear to invite contemplative reflection. And because pure color, black more than other colors, was most often described by mid-century European and American critics as a form of negation of worldly values, the paintings would have offered the possibility of a disinterested, even transcendental, aesthetic experience. But the promise of transcendence in Souza's paintings were the results of misapprehension. In other words, not transcendence, but the limits of vision. For underneath the surface lurked landscapes and portraits whose smidgens became vaguely discernible only after the eyes adjusted to blackness. Seeing through blackness necessitated a kind of funambulist opticality, whose demand bordered on the acrobatic. In order to see the figures embedded in black paint, the viewer had to assume a range of difficult postures and hold them until the angle of light and vision was suitable for viewing to finally begin. Yet, even as Souza compelled his audiences to bend and lean sideways in a way that altered the conditions of seeing, the clandestine figures hidden behind black pigment did not depend on the viewer's cooperation in order to become representation, for the figures had an existence independent of the viewer's vision of bodily contortions. If anything, the complex calisthenics involved in viewing Souza's black paintings only confirmed the impossibility of any unmediated transparency in cognition, while simultaneously organizing the act of seeing around bodily rather than transcendental color fields. In 1966, such an approach to color was shocking for Souza's viewers, for it pushed, on the one hand, against the vexed associations between blackness and primitivism, inherited from pre-war European modernism, think Picasso, and on the other hand, against debates on color and transcendentalism that was unfolding across the North Atlantic, think Rothko, and a host of others. Souza's large corpus of Black paintings, about 60 in total, has continued to prove challenging for art historians and curators alike, especially because no other South Asian artist had engaged with the color Black in quite the same way. What meaning did Black as a color have for an artist like Souza, a post-colonial artist who had come of age in the 1950s? What prompted Souza to dialogue with and dissent from the dominant discourses of post-war art? And what did the color Black have to do with this? These questions have an urgency that is both disciplinary and otherwise. As some may be aware, the story of the global histories of post-colonial modernisms, within which Souza figures prominently, has received significant attention in recent years. To put it synoptically, scholars have highlighted the ways in which particular strands of North Atlantic modern art came to be embraced, albeit with profound reorientation by artists such as Souza and a host of others from dissonant national contexts. This line of analysis has opened up an image of global modernisms as a theater of imagined transnational collectivities, conceptual improvisations, and inventive interpolations. However, this line of analysis has also implicitly positioned global modern art solely in a dialogic relationship with Europe's modernist imaginary. I want to argue instead that Souza's incredibly large corpus of darker paintings not only advance our understanding of the artist's oeuvre as a whole, but also demand a rethinking of the politics and poetics of color in post-war art more broadly. As such, this line of inquiry vitalizes concerns of pictorial representation with pressing questions of political representation. As a number of historians have argued, decolonization accrued tremendous intellectual force and a wide affective reach after the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung, Indonesia, which inaugurated the Third World Project in 1955 and laid the groundwork for the subsequent formalization of the non-aligned movement in 1961. In the mid-1950s, thinkers of decolonization, such as the Martinican poet, playwright, and politician Aimé Césaire, and the Senegalese representative in the French Senate from 1946 to 48, poet and editor of the influential Francophone journal Présence Africaine, Alioune Diop, had already begun to describe Bandung as foundational for a third world practice. In London, where Souza lived from 49 to 67, third world intellectual consciousness deeply affected diasporic artists and novelists, as the then London-based Caribbean novelist Samuel Selwyn noted. Yet, even as the political implications of the non-aligned movement, including its connections with the civil rights movement in the United States, has been well explored in recent scholarship from the disciplines of history and political science, we know little about the ways in which such processes of decolonization activated artistic vision. Souza's Black paintings nuance this post-war picture. Yet, common sense suggests that such non-aligned entanglements across the non-aligned world, whose geographic coordinates intersected with that of the Third World and later the Global South, disarticulated the presumptive centrality of the proverbial West. But we have little perspective on the ways in which these may have animated artistic vision. Against this conceptual opacity, I propose a conjunctural history that mobilizes pictorial language as a lens to unpack the intersections between decolonization and non-alignment and artistic expression. Decolonization, of course, was not a word Souza used, as he was living through the processes that we now describe as decolonization. He and his contemporaries still thought in terms of imperialism, domination, and oppression for this very reason. Born in 1924 in Portuguese Goa, Souza began his career in British Bombay. Described in 1989 by the cultural critic Greta Kapoor as an infant terrible, all the more dangerous because he belonged to the oppressed races, Souza was considered by many of his contemporaries in India and Britain to be one among the most noteworthy living artists. As a mark of protest against the prescriptive dictates of the Bombay Art Society, the colonial era institution, which was still the primary forum for artists in the city in the late 1940s, Souza had joined the painters Hussain Ara Raza Gade and the sculptor Bhakre to form the Progressive Artist Group in 1947, the year of India's independence. The invocation of the word progressive in the group's title was not incidental. The Progressive Artist Group was formed at a time when the word progressive functioned as a cipher for an ideological affiliation with the international left and against manifestations of imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism within and outside the country. The alliance between the Progressive Artist Group and leftist politics in India was forged by Souza, who started reading Marx sometimes around 1944 and identified with leftist cultural movements even after severing ties with the Communist Party of India due to a series of disagreements with the Politburo regarding the subject matter proper to revolutionary art. However, rather than attenuating his initial revolutionary fervor, Souza's separation from the Communist Party served to consolidate an artistic imagination that not only sublimated politics into aesthetics, but also transformed the notion of political autonomy into a creative ideal. Souza came of age as an artist in London. The publication of his oft-quoted first autobiographical essay in the influential literary magazine Encounter in 1955 corresponded with the opening of his first major solo exhibition at Gallery 1, an art gallery established by the Surrealist poet and maverick art dealer Victor Musgrave in Soho. This brought him to the attention of leading Marxist art critics such as John Berger. In 1964, when the Tate Gallery acquired a painting, Souza also became one of the first South Asian artists to be represented in the permanent collection of any major modern art museum on either side of the North Atlantic. Although Souza's foreignness was often commented upon, his paintings smell of brimstone and betel nut, the art critic Nigel Gosling wrote. The prodigious amount of critical literature published on the artist by his European contemporaries nonetheless signaled his burgeoning international reputation. Still, Souza continued to struggle with the impact that his otherness had on his career in Europe. Having left his native country at the age of 25, he had become something of an outsider there as well. I will not resituate Souza within the histories of British art or within any other nationally delimited history. Neither will I posit Souza's creative imagination as coterminous with the entire cluster of political and intellectual movements of decolonization, nor will I suggest that the color black was Souza's sole artistic concern. Rather, I will mobilize the color black as a lens to unpack intricate intersections between liberatory politics and artistic expression in the mid-decades of the 20th century. This conjunctural history proposed here will reveal how Souza's black paintings staged a confrontation between the formal and material interests of art history and the socio-political conditions that shaped them. As such, this line of inquiry has meaningful implications for broad disciplinary concerns. Most pressingly, Souza's darker paintings urge us to consider rearranging the coordinates of decolonization in post-war art along an axis that is far more capacious than we have acknowledged thus far. Let us return to Souza's Black paintings to explore the broader stakes of my proposition. Blackness as a subject of representation in Souza's oeuvre was first intimated through figuration and color in the 1954 painting Reclining Nude. The odorless-like reclining female figure occupies the entire pictorial surface that is shorn of any embellishment or prop, aside from a deep red and maroon backdrop. The very presence of the figure, not because of its nudity, but because of color, breaks down imagined ideological, political, and social distances between the Black body and its corporeal imprint in the history of art. As scholars have shown, even after the abolition of slavery in 1848 in France, the Black female body remained configured as an attendant or subservient figure in the works of French artists such as Manet, among others. Think Olympia. Souza, who received training in European academic art at the Jeju School of Art in colonial Bombay between 1940 and 45, and was introduced to French and German artists by the city's interwar diasporic Jewish intellectual community, was all too conversant with his art historical trajectory. But having no access to African American art and literature, he could not possibly have known of the positive reconfiguration of the Black body by artists and intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance in the United States. How then are we to position such a radical uptake on Black bodies by a South Asian artist whose intellectual formation occurred at a far remove from the historical crucible of the Black Atlantic, or even the work of his African American contemporaries? It is worth recalling that Souza had arrived in London from India in 1949 with a Portuguese passport. Souza's native Goa on the western coast of present-day India was at the time still a Portuguese colony and would remain so until it was ceded to India in 1961. Having once served as the capital of Portugal's Estrado da India Empire, a territory stretching from East Africa to Malacca in Southeast Asia, Goa had remained connected to Indian Ocean Portuguese territories through the shared history of Catholic inquisitions, the continued movement of people, objects, and ideas across colonies in Asia and Africa, enduring debates on race and miscegenation, and the experience of ongoing colonial domination. For a Portuguese subject, the color Black then had a very distinct meaning. Under the oppression of the whites, the Black man had cried out in blues, Souza wrote in a 1955 autobiographical essay. Painted 2 years later, the iconic blue-black figure placed upon the thick white impasto surface in Souza's Negro in Mourning echoed the tragedy of colonialism as recounted in the dialogic among the whites, blacks, and blues in his autobiographical essay, as if the dripping lines of paint were but streaming drops of tears, bodily secretions, embedded as marks of oppression in the viscous materiality of color pigment. Notably, by the time Negro in Mourning was painted, the history of colonial oppression was becoming entangled for Souza with the lived milieu of post-imperial London, where artists and writers from former colonies such as South Asia and the British West Indies found accommodation in crowded bedsits and cramped apartments in neighborhoods like Belsize Square and Notting Hill. Merely months after Negro in Mourning was painted, Violence erupted in Notting Hill, not far from Belsize Square, where Souza lived, when a white working-class mob led a week-long armed attack on West Indian immigrants in the fall of 1958. As Souza recalled, I painted Negro in Mourning in London when the race riots flared. I personally think it is one of my best works. Socialist realist, maybe. Expressionism, certainly. Moreover, Negro is in Mourning is close to the bone of man because it is about the color of skin. The plot thickens if we account for a sketch completed in the previous year. The 1957 painting Negro in Mourning, it turns out, was based on a portrait of the African-American jazz maestro, Louis Armstrong, who had arrived in London in the summer of 1956. We can assume that Souza was becoming more familiar with the African-American civil rights discourses as these were being transposed onto the British cultural and political landscape through figures such as Paul Robeson and others. Through such circuitous ambits, Souza was also finding bonhomie with diasporic Caribbean intellectuals such as Samuel Sullivan, whose 1956 novel, The Lonely Londoners, was an extensive mediation on racial blackness and the color black. On this accord, the following monologue, directed to his own skin by the protagonist Galahad in Selvan's novel, is exceptionally telling, writes Selvan in a distinctly Creole diction. And Galahad watched the color of his hand and talking to it, saying, "Color, is you that causing all this, you know?" So Galahad talking to color black as if is a person, telling it that is not he who causing botheration in the place, but black, who's a worthless thing for making trouble all about. Black, you see what you caused to happen today, caused to happen yesterday? I went to look at that room that Ram tell about in the gate. And as soon as the landlady see you, she say the room let already. He ain't even give me a second chance to say good morning. And why the hell you can't change color? It's not weed that people don't like, Galahad goes on to say. It's the color black. The emphasis on the color black is telling, as is the accentuation of the social transgressions that, according to Selvan's Trinidadian protagonist Galahad, was perpetuated by it. But herein also lay a confounding representational paradox, one that substantially concerned Souza. Color, which was often believed to be subservient to line, form, and composition, had remained conspicuously absent in post-war modernist art historical analysis until the 1970s, at least in the North Atlantic context. But more than any other color, it was black that was caught in a condition of double erasure. Most theorists of modern Western art in the 1950s considered black to be a non-color and therefore relevant only as a shadow, an obverse of true colors, or better still, a negation of color. While I cannot dwell in any depth on the complexity within the art history of color, let me just say that many of the painters with whose work Souza was perhaps the most familiar had eliminated the color black even from shadows, choosing instead to simulate the effect of darkness by combining blues, greens, and reds. According to Souza, Renoir disliked the achromatic color so much that he compared a spot of black to a hole in the painting. And at the other end was the history of European modernist primitivism, which implicitly collocated the color with the naive, the infantile, the uncivilized, the savage, and the barbaric. This is, of course, a history with which we are all too familiar by now. This history, however, was sharply offset by the implacable centrality of Blackness in a very different register of intellectual thought and practice. For the color Black was already interpellated by the energies of decolonization. Initiated by Senghor, Césaire, and Damas in Paris, the negritude movement had already marshaled the negative energies implicit in a term like negre to enunciate a new dialectic of Black consciousness well before the beginning of the Second World War. Souza himself encountered negritude in the early 1950s, not through Senghor, Césaire, or Damas, but through the French existentialist Sartre. When Souza first met Sartre in Paris, the English translation of Black Orpheus, Sartre's extended critical essay on negritude written in 1948 as an introduction to a major anthology of negritude poetry, had just been published. Black is a color, Sartre had affirmed, and liberty is the color of the night. Sartre's delineation of the color Black as the only viable praxis of revolution in the 20th century was perhaps most generative for Souza, who separated from the Communist Party in 1948, but was progressively becoming more and more steeped in Marxist and anti-imperial intellectual movements during his London years. As we will see, for Souza, the color mattered, and it mattered in more ways than one. In the 1950s, the color Black became more and more central to Souza's palette, in turn fusing representational concerns with questions of race, imperialism, class, and keeping the Goan context in mind, caste oppression. Souza's life-size 1959 painting Crucifixion, for example, depicted Christ not in the form of a fair-skinned beatific icon, but as a misshapen Black figure bearing marks of brutalization. In this instance, the coloration of the sacramental body was especially significant. For unlike the Iberian colonial worlds of Spanish America and the Philippines, where the Black Christ, Cristo Negro, or the Black Nazarene, enabled indigenous communities to radically refashion Christianity in their own image, the color Black was already internal to the dynamics of Hindu caste oppression in pre-colonial Goa. Then, in Goa, where Souza spent his childhood, the color had a very different density, and indeed, it ciphered a very different notion of marginality and oppression. As others have shown, Portuguese proselytization in Goa strategically assimilated pre-existing social hierarchies ordered around caste or varna, literally color, which historically allocated Blackness to lower castes, Shudras, slaves or dasas, and other purported enemies of the fair-skinned upper caste Aryans. Such epidermal hierarchies reflected in representational registers as well. This is clearly discernible in a 17th century Goan oil painting, which shows Francis Xavier, the co-founder of the Society of Jesus, baptizing a low-caste Paravar fisherman. Within this context, the color Black, a means of picturing subalternity, was no doubt incredibly charged. Incidentally, Crucifixion was one of the two paintings that Souza completed in the summer of 1959. The second painting, Nyssa Nigris with Flowers of Thorns, was a direct reference to the ongoing liberation struggle in the British protectorate of Nyasaland or Malawi in Central Africa, as the title indicates. The British governor of Nyasaland had just declared a state of emergency, and this served as the immediate point of reference. But rather than drawing on symbols with readily legible reference, Souza assembled a series of vexed cultural associations. The Nyasa figure resembled totemic sculptures removed from the African continent by European explorers and housed in various museums across Europe. Thus, even as the title of the painting contextualized the figure within the geopolitical space of Malawi, the formal constitution of the figure collapsed the distinction between the socio-political body and its cultural manifestation as image in a way that dispensed with any pretension of representational transparency. The bristling thorns emanating from the hair recalled talismanic African sculptures fitted with copper and iron nails, and the fetishization of such objects by modernist primitivists such as Picasso and others in the pre-war years. At the same time, the crucifix-like form with protruding thorns ominously piercing the side of the face necessarily entangled the history of modern Western art with the history of colonialism. Souza's paintings from the 1950s thus imparted a historical sensibility to pictorial surface by consolidating a range of critical concerns around the color black. His aesthetic philosophy, too, assembled discrete ideas drawn from seemingly disparate contexts, negritude, Marxism, and the history of colonialism, to shape an aesthetic vocabulary that was entirely his own. British critics, however, failed to make note of Souza's unconventional approach to blackness, likely due to the ambiguous status of the color black in modern art historiography. For most, the nailed martyr was most quelling. But the point did not escape West Africa-based German Jewish Uli Bear, whose critical vision was singularly influential in shaping Nigeria's post-war modernism in the lines with the ideals put forward by the founders of the Negritude movement. Notably, the impact of the Bandung Conference had left a deep note on him, Bear, and when Bear stumbled upon Souza's Crucifixion and Niasa Nigris with Flowers of Thorns, among other paintings, when he visited an exhibition in London in 1959, he immediately recognized the echoes of Bandung. Returning to Nigeria, he published an important article on Souza in the Black Phoenix, the cultural magazine whose title, not coincidentally, drew upon Sartre's Black Orpheus, the same essay that had also animated Souza's imagination. By drawing upon a wide array of historical sources, Bear believed that Souza had transcended both national and European painterly conventions to develop a new language of expression that not only resonated across colonized and formerly colonized worlds, but also centralized a critique of oppression as such. We may recognize this as an artistic facet of decolonization, one that is worked out not just through iconography, but also in terms of color. It is not as if Souza stopped using colors other than black. Rather, the paintings that he completed in the early 1960s marked a transition in his chromatic vocabulary. Nowhere is this more palpable than in the 1962 canvas based on Picasso's 1907 Maids of Avignon, a work that was described by the curator Alfred Barr as the masterpiece of Picasso's Negro period. Souza's tryst with Maids of Avignon is hardly surprising, given his painted artistic predilections. Moreover, Picasso's incorporation of African influences in the painting was already a matter of substantial discussion in the 1960s. Writing in 1960, the art historian Robert Rosenblum was echoing a broader scholarly consensus when he wrote that it is exactly this new freedom in the exploration of mass and void, line and plane, color and value, independent from representation and ends, that makes the painting so crucial for the still more radical liberties of the mature years of Cubism. By and large, mid-century discussions on the work largely cohered around its structural logic, the incorporation of Iberian and African influences, and above all, the historic importance of the work in the formal opening up of the picture plane to abstraction. Souza, who acknowledged an almost Oedipal fixation with Picasso in an unpublished 1962 interview, was no doubt familiar with these ideas. Then, his retake of the painting was hardly innocuous. In Souza's 1962 painting, the color black remained restricted to borders and cross-hatchings. He rendered the 5 figures in a ghostly white hue against a muddy background composed of a mixture of magenta, red, orange, yellow, blue, and green, all the colors listed on Goethe's famous symmetric color wheel. By this time, Souza had already considered the German philosopher's theory of colors, and going by the simultaneous mobilization of Goethe's entire color field in the 1962 painting, he had also summarily debunked Goethe's subjective chromatic allegories as sentimental and pictographically untenable. It would appear that he was somewhat more convinced by Goethe's leading opponent, Newton, who had placed the entire emphasis of his scientific color theory on the study of light. But Newton's color wheel was not entirely adequate for Souza's purpose, either, as it did not allocate any function for achromatic black, which absorbs heat and light, or white, which scatters all the visible wavelengths of light. Souza's solution to this achromatic conundrum was quite novel, as is hinted in a letter written to his friend, the surrealist poet Victor Musgrave, during a visit to India in the summer of 1960. Pressed to describe his experiences to his friend, he confesses that he does not know very much about the political situation as he was returning to Bombay after 10 years. But the sun, he writes, is red hot and blazes like hell. Sky, trees, rooftops, roads, and objects in the sun are white with heat. Here, white is already immanent with destructive energy. Speaking to the artist and cultural critic Rashid Areen several years later, Souza would go as far as to designate white as the color of empire. These comments were not naive or uninformed creative appositions on the part of the artist. The ekphrastic invocation of iridation, that is, color's ability to suffuse the surrounding space in the visual field, in Souza's 1962 letter clearly belies a sound grasp of color science. In retrospect, this makes Souza's empirically flawed, idiosyncratic inversion of the heat-absorbent quality of black and the reflective attribute of white telling, especially as he proceeds to visually work out the main issues at stake in the shockingly pale figures central to his 1962 retake of Picasso's Maids of Avignon. In Souza's painting, all markers of blackness, associative, notional, or otherwise, are seemingly annulled. Unlike the robust presence of the 5 female figures in Picasso, the ones in Souza's painting are ghostly, almost transparent, weightless, as if evacuated of all substance. The effect of insubstantiality, of course, is compounded by the paleness of coloration. But the appearance of the figures also has something to do with the manner in which the painting was created. Souza acquired a transparency projector sometime in the early 1960s. With the help of this machine, he started tracing photographic prints on acetate sheets. The endless fragmentation of pre-existing imagery that this new technique engendered had far-reaching implications for Souza's painterly practice. Most significantly, the technique opened up the possibility of approaching the canvas as an essential site of displacement. This is how one critic who observed Souza at work described it. The artist selected a page. With a pen and black ink, he swiftly distilled a drawing from the photograph, dispensed with the booklet, and laid the transparency on the horizontal glass of the machine. The light was switched on and the drawing projected onto the working area. With charcoal, the artist then made a second adaptation over the lines of the first sketch, switched off the projector, and the final drawing was exposed. Souza pointed out that this was purely a drawing. In case of a painting, the charcoal phase would have been omitted and colors substituted. The process of excerpting, recombining, and rendering transparent enabled a painterly method of endless mutations and disarticulations that helped to render hollow, that is, evacuate of meaning and power or make absent the given image that served as the artist's point of departure. The 1962 painting was made with this new technique of transparency and projection. The act of rendering transparent the Maids of Avignon, the most important single pictorial document that the 20th century had yet produced, according to one contemporaneous critique, certainly constituted a form of pictorial iconoclasm in itself. But the invocation of a park in Belsize Square, where immigrants from South Asia and the Caribbean, including Souza, lived, in the title of the painting was perhaps even more incendiary. For the loud and piquant public presence of immigrants in cafes, theaters, and parks was perceived as a transgression of the British social order, as is chronicled in Selwyn's 1956 novel, The Lonely Londoners. Ironically, Picasso had initially titled his own painting The Brothel of Avignon, and critics in the 1960s often portrayed the two darker figures with African masks as more grotesque, more barbaric than the comparatively benign, light-skinned Iberian prostitutes in the center, and more likely to be contagion-ridden. This is what William Rubin had to say about the two darker figures in a 1983 article published in the Art Bulletin. We sense the phantophobia in the primordial horror evoked by the monstrously distorted heads of the two whores on the right of the picture, so opposite to those of the comparatively gracious Iberian courtesans in the center. One can hardly imagine the fear, the shock and awe these heads must have imparted in 1907. And Rubin continues more to the point of race in representation. These African faces express more, I believe, than just the barbaric character of pure sexuality noted by Steenberg. They finally conjure something that transcends our civilizational experience, something ominous and monstrous, such as Quds discovered in the heart of darkness. Thus, even as the painting marked for art history that precise juncture of a paradigmatic shift from contextual to formal exegesis so central to 20th century modernism, the terms of critical ekphrasis, internalized stereotypes long associated with dark-skinned peoples. That Souza opted to magnify Picasso's two darker figures and make the rest diminutive in contrast is surely not coincidental. Thinking transversely, we could even say that the painting was about the color black. For despite its absence, the presence of the color was made implicit via recourse to an art historical imaginary surrounding the Maids of Avignon, worked out formally by magnifying the darker figures of Picasso's painting and grounded in space through the precise geographic coordinates of Belsize Park. Perhaps the absence of the color black was also a sardonic commentary on racial discrimination, as the painting was conceived and executed in the same year that the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, an anti-color legislative act that substantially curtailed the Rights of Immigrants from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, was passed in the British Parliament. The Act codified immigration along racial lines that tacitly conflated the color of skin with urban discontentment brought about by pressure on housing, unemployment, racial conflict, and urban decay. As a site of intersectionality, the color was progressively becoming overdetermined, indeed overburdened. The very word color now mobilized an entire social, cultural, and political system of epidermal-based exclusion based on the logic of the ocular. Criminals and degenerates, it was argued, looked a certain way. To be sure, the exclusionary optics of color impacted Souza's chromatic thought, prompting him to approach the subject of the color black by other means. In the 1950s, Souza had frequently mobilized the color black as a clearly delineated visible mark on an encumbered physical trace on the pictorial surface. The paintings from the early 1960s indicate that the artist had begun to think of the color as more than the sum of pigments. But still, the color black worked as a sine doce, as if it could neither shake off its political imago nor exceed it. Therefore, Souza wished to exceed opticality and surface to activate blackness otherwise, to make the color black the primary subject of representation. Only with the black paintings, which Souza began in 1964, does the color black become agentive as a pictorial proposition. The color black is the subject of Souza's monochromatic black art series, but not all of Souza's monochromes are uniformly dark or monotonously matte. One canvas has a glossy reflective surface, while another has a lighter matte hue. A third is rendered with a minor black-brown tint, and a fourth is a mixture of matte and glass. Such variations withstanding, the color black is the subject of the paintings. And it is in this sense that the entire body of works also appear at the first glance to be non-representational mediations on color, thus seemingly confirming to the highly mediatic and ocular emphasis in formalist discourses that dominated critical lexica in the mid-decades of the 20th century. This ostentatious mediatic focus, however, constitutes an elaborate subterfuge of the very same critical emphasis that the paintings appear to uphold. For the putative emptiness that meets the eye at the initial glance is but an ocular misapprehension, as figural imagery lurks immediately beneath the seemingly ungiving black surface. Although the figurative renditions bear stylistic homology with the works completed in the previous years, there is nonetheless a crucial distinction between Souza's previous experiments with the color black and the black paintings of the mid-1960s. Figures had been presented as images ensconced within the limits of the canvas in the artist's earlier paintings. Their address to the viewer had also been primarily optical. It is not that figures in the black paintings now refuse such an address. It is just that the painter has become far less acquiescent of the so-called disinterested gaze. Most notably, the black paintings resist vision. When I first encountered Souza's black paintings at the Kiran Nadar Museum in New Delhi, I was struck not by the paintings, but by my own inability to see. This resistance to vision is what activates the black paintings, as the barely discernible smidgens of embedded presence underneath the black pigment demand a very different kind of embodied looking. I twisted, turned, bent, until the black forms rendered in thick impasto strokes surfaced as if out of their own violation. Once the angle of light and my angle of vision were perfectly aligned. I was finally seeing, but not merely through the eyes. Furthermore, the artist had hidden a second multichromatic layer underneath the thick black surface of some of the paintings. This layer has become partially visible only recently, after some of the canvases have developed craquelure across the cutaneous exterior, as the black paint layers have aged and shrunk back to reveal a subterranean anthropomorphism, a body within a body. The specific method of embedding and layering the body of the canvas, conceptualized as both surface and depth, the body of color, the colored body, perhaps derived from the technology of transparency and projection, which necessarily made the process of mark making striated for the artist. But I want to emphasize that this method of embedding an embodiment is not simply a result of painterly procedure. Rather, it indicates a cautious employment of bodily comportment. Consider a 1964 documentary photograph of the artist at work on a black painting. Souza crouches on the ground, arms extended for the benefit of the camera, in a gesture that clearly has more to do with staging than it has to do with painting. Souza returned to such documentary photographs of himself with insistent abandon as he began to cut and splice photographs in his sketchbooks in the early 1960s. As visible in one folio, he also refurbished such photo compilations with a serial structural logic that implicitly drew into the quotient his own body. The photographic compilation anticipated the chromatic seriality of the black paintings, while the cover of the black art and other paintings catalog reenacted the structural logic of the photographic folio, the latter originally envisioned as a private exercise in photo collage. Of course, there are some obvious differences in what the photographs actually show. The ones in the photo compilation record artistic process and thus belong to a documentary genre, while the one on the cover of the catalog is a single black and white formal portrait of the artist, now cut into 16 uneven squares and laid on a rough grid. Aside from such distinctions, the primary additive element in the catalog is a seemingly bland silver coating that, if scratched away by an inquisitive viewer, reveals two dark figures fully covered in a glossy plastic polyvinyl chloride outfit flanking the artist. The cover of the exhibition catalog was designed by Souza, and as such, it elucidates a particular dialogic between the ocular and the corporeal that the black paintings also instantiate. Precisely how this structural logic springs from the technology of transparency and projection is difficult to extrapolate, as Souza did not expound upon this matter. But the connection can certainly be sustained by way of juxtaposition. Such juxtapositions relentlessly return us to the body, the artist's own body, the cutaneous quality of the paintings, the contorted body of the viewer. It is tempting to read into this insistence on the body an oblique reference to Souza's Paris-based Martinican contemporary Frantz Fanon, whose profound influence on contemporaneous intellectual thought and decolonial politics is now widely acknowledged. As others have noted, Fanon's delirious array of self-images in black-skinned white masks were all tethered to imperialist stereotypes of blackness. I was battered down by tom-toms, cannibalism, intellectual deficiency, fetishism, racial defects. Such a sense of the corporeal could not be simply assimilated into the Cartesian distinction between the mind and the body as consciousness and cognition refracts, in Fanon's terms, in that returning grace. Look, a Negro of the white European. The corporeal body was for Fanon the source of an impossibly fractured but crucial crucible of a black consciousness that functioned through a making that was not quite its own. Certain threads of corresponding intellectual strands between Fanon and Souza have been alluded to by the artist, critic, and third world theorist Rashid Areen. But in a sense, Souza's own mediations on blackness in the Black Art series resist such a gaze. For the pigmental density in Souza's black paintings categorically rejects any visual reckoning with the color black that proceeds from generalized dermatological assumptions. Moreover, Souza is not, strictly speaking, an artist of African descent. Then, what he insists upon in place of generality is, as performance studies scholar Fred Moten so wonderfully put it in a different context, the irredeemably homelessness common to the colonized, the enslaved, and the enclosed. Conceivably, there is no simple way to communicate a chromatic schema that places color at the intersections of the language of art and the language of decolonization, except via the sociability of viewing. This sociability is how the Black paintings work. In the absence of this contact, they retract into the inertness of monochromatic oversaturation, as if parodying the essentializing chromatic valence of the color black as a non-color, negation of color, stasis, and absence. This language of negation is exactly what Ad Reinhardt, another painter of monochromes, used to describe the color black. But for Souza, an artist of color, black was fundamentally kinetic. The color black stood not for stasis, but for the incalculable rhythm of movement that did not heed any critical protocol that distinguished aesthetic experience from the experience of the everyday. Consequently, the obstinate opacity presented by the Black paintings was not resolved but only magnified in photography. When underexposed, the Black figures retrocede into the Black surface. When overexposed, the pictorial surface is distorted by refraction, thus inclining the color black towards white or gray. Then the body matters in the Black paintings almost as much as color matters for Souza. If we still believe that transcendence is at all implied in the color black, then this impossibility is all but dispensed in Souza's Black paintings. We may recall that monochromatic painting, of which Malevich's 1913 Black Square was an early example, has been consecrated in art history as a tangible expression of the subliminal. In 1950s Paris, Souza's contemporary Yves Klein had already adopted the idea of pure realms of color and color as a spiritual realm. In New York, the color field painter Mark Rothko insisted on color's ability to express basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on, to precipitate a transcendental encounter with infinity. In hindsight, the association of the color black in post-war art with infinity, purity, spirituality, and transcendence may appear universal. But in insisting that his viewers twist, bend, and turn, Souza harbored an aspiration of a very different sort. Let us not forget that when wielded by the disenfranchised in the second half of the 20th century, the color black, the negritude poetics of the color black, the black of the Black Panthers, the black flag of dispersed anarchist groups across the world, functioned as chromatic contractions of resistance. Thinking in terms of race and color then demands a constant alertness to such contractions, so that the intersecting vectors of art, decolonization, and non-alignment can be present once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for your truly fascinating talk. I learned so much from it, as I'm sure everyone in our audience did. And it was amazing. You had images that we could see the figures in the black paintings. So what kind of photography or lighting is necessary to bring out the figures from these paintings that, as you said, at first seemed to be completely black?
I have to confess that most of the images that I show are professionally taken and thereafter manipulated. The photographs that I have taken are quite unusable. And a substantial amount of photoshopping does not recover them. The image does not, in fact, come to surface. You may have noticed that some photographs have a shine to it. And those are the ones that were perhaps more resistant to photography than some others. In other words, it is quite difficult to reproduce Souza's black paintings in photography, in part because they truly do not give themselves very easily. They tend to either get washed out or the figures invisible.
So is that resistance to reproduction a part of the point, that it requires that presence of the viewer in front of the picture to move the body around, as you described, that sort of is demanding that you be in the presence of these in order to actually discern the figuration?
There are some accounts from contemporaneous viewers, those who saw the black paintings exhibition in the 1960s, and they all describe going through this bodily movement. And there's also a brief recollection from Souza's partner who mentions that Souza viewed the paintings himself, having placed light at various points. So it is almost as if the viewing experience was pre-choreographed and central to the compositions themselves.
And one more question. I don't want to monopolize, and Rachel will provide questions from the rest of the audience. His figuration, is he just working from imagination, or does he ever work from models? I mean, you talked about the use of transparencies, but where do these figures come from?
He did work from models, and it is likely that he sketched from models and thereafter transferred it into a transparency to be replicated. But in many instances, the transparencies were cases where Souza was working from a reproduced image. He would, after the black paintings, also go on to work directly on the printed image using what he described as chemical painting. So essentially, he was burning out portions of printed images with chemical and reworking others. And sometimes he was also overworking an already printed image. Like in most cases, these are taken from newspapers and journals. And in almost all instances, they are of some political relevance.
That's interesting. Do you think that the figures in the black paintings are intended to be read as having certain identities or certain, meaning in a particular context, or are they just generic? I mean, have you thought about that aspect of the pictures?
In a way, the figures that appear in the black paintings also appear in his other works. So, as such, the figures are not substantially different. But whereas in the other paintings, there is something at stake in the representation itself, a representation that gives to the eye in a manner that's relatively more direct than the black paintings. In the black paintings, the pigment and the figures do a very similar kind of work. They become one and the same, in other words. and so in that distinction, they are quite distinct and different from Souza's really large body of works.
I love that the figures and the paint become one and the same. Yeah. Rachel, do you want to offer some other questions?
Yes, that was such an interesting dialogue that you shared. So thank you for all of those questions and for your responses, Dr. Gupta. The chat is just filling up with questions and a lot of applause emojis. You have a very grateful audience. So I'll start with a question from our own committee member, Maggie, who said, as an art history student, I often find it difficult to analyze an artwork outside of the Western-centric approaches to visual analysis that I was trained to use. How do you work to see important aspects of artworks, such as color, that are largely absent in modernist and formalist approaches to visual analysis?
That is a wonderful question, and one that my own students pose to me every once in a while. I found it useful to go back to writings by non-European artists, especially from the context that I work on, the context of South Asia. There's a lot of writing about not seeing, turning away. The preponderant emphasis on opticality or vision is one, I believe, something that comes from a Western art historiography, the ways in which the discipline evolved in Europe. At the same time, I will also say that our tendency is often to overlook the writings by indigenous thinkers and artists, in part because because they present themselves in a manner that we are not quite, the language is not quite familiar. We're used to reading art history in a certain way. We are used to certain components of art or artistic practice being emphasized. But when we encounter its other, we set it aside in part because it somehow doesn't fit into the way in which we've been taught to see, write, and think about art. So my response to this question is really the same as what I keep telling my students. Let's set that aside. There are many kinds of practices. There are many kinds of art writings, and even as art theory may be presented to us in a certain package. If we expand our zone of interpretation, we will find that there are other theories of vision, and those animate other modes of thinking and writing about art.
Thank you so much. We have another question that I think actually would have been a great follow-up to the conversation that you and Dr. Kataforis were just having, which is from Vidita Raina, who said, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Gupta. You discussed your own experience of viewing Souza's Black paintings. Could you speak to the broader reception of these paintings, both locally and globally?
So this is something that I didn't talk about enough in the paper, but in its own time, Souza's Black paintings received extreme praise from a small group of viewers and extreme criticism from a very large audience, who described it as a kind of a gimmick on part of an artist who wants to make his presence felt. Such was the response that Souza would leave London and relocate to New York almost immediately after the Black Art and Other Paintings exhibition, and he refused to display the works ever again within his own lifetime. And slowly but surely the works got lost from an art historical consciousness as well. And there is, in fact, relatively little writing on this large body of works. And by large, I mean at least 60 canvases have now been located. And the Black paintings came back into public view not long ago in the 2000s, when Grosvenor Gallery, where the initial exhibition had also taken place, restaged the Black paintings exhibition. But even that didn't generate a large body of writing or substantial criticism. I believe this is because the Black paintings are in fact incredibly difficult, not just to see, but also to process. They are complex, they're almost pictorial propositions, but they're also theoretical propositions in themselves. They ask us to rethink the emphasis that we put on vision, rethink the ways in which we think about color. They are largely considered to be extremely difficult. And this is something that was also noted by one critic in Souza's own lifetime, who writes that it is difficult to write about the Black paintings because I can't see them and I can't reproduce them. So there's that. But I'll also describe to you, I'll say a little more about my own experience of seeing them. So I was in this museum, a quiet white cube, really twisting myself into impossible postures. No one does that in a public space. And I hadn't noticed that I'd gathered quite a crowd. And some ventured, eventually after a while, some ventured close and asked students, it turned out, art history students in New Delhi. And they asked, "What are you doing?" Then I explained that you can't see the paintings. It appears to be flat and monochromatic, but in fact they're not. So if you work hard enough, you could actually see them. And they too then started twisting themselves, and could eventually see the figures. And so they are incredibly difficult to view even in person. They ask a lot of the viewer.
That's I was so fascinated by that kind of the somatic experience of the paintings, and that actually I wanted to shine a light quickly on a question that we received from Catherine White, who thanked you for your talk, and also was wondering about the initial reaction from viewers to the paintings. And Catherine wrote, with viewers bending and looking closely to see the images, I'm curious if there is a record of some viewers who had more of a, quote, disinterested gaze, not wanting to spend the time to fully see. And was Souza interested in how these images might only engage with those who would put in the effort to see the images? And so it seems almost like that is a case in point of that phenomenon.
I believe that is true. I believe that Souza wished the images to be seen by those who actually were willing to engage with the paintings on their own terms. And in the 1960s, the question of viewership or viewing or seeing was also quite complicated, because the anti-immigrant laws and continuous racial disturbances were really part and parcel of the context in which the paintings were displayed. And within that scheme, it was expected that a non-European artist would offer some kind of ethnographic or anthropological insight into a certain culture or place. But Souza's paintings withholds that, and withholds that quite boldly, and withholds that, in fact, quite fully. And that was disturbing for British viewers. There isn't, in fact, any record of of a disinterested viewership. There are records of critics who were very troubled by the experience, who felt that this was simply a gimmick, something to catch attention.
Well, we have several questions about professional practice and about the kind of ongoing movements at the time and Souza's own participation in them. But I really quickly and perhaps selfishly wanted to sneak in a question that I had since the beginning of the talk, actually, when you showed those really striking photos by, I believe, Ida Carr. I really was struck by Souza's presence in those photos and the ways that he was posing with his paintings. And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about those photos by Carr and how you think they perhaps might engage with the broader series of Black art paintings, since we're talking about the body and about posing.
That's really a wonderful question. Souza's, in all of Souza's, so this particular set of photographs were taken during a photo shoot that Ida Carr did with Souza. Ida Carr was Victor Musgrave's partner, and Souza was very close to both. And it is through Ida Carr and Musgrave that he actually has access to an entire host of radical intellectuals and artists from Africa, Asia, as well as the Caribbean. And what is striking about those photographs, but also others, and this is Souza's photograph typically have this sense of great theatricality. It's never simply posed, but the body animates the work that is also being recorded or documented. This goes on to show this intersection of body and work that ultimately goes on to really shape the Black paintings, right? And even in the photographs that were taken of Souza using a projector, they're fascinating to me in part because Souza couldn't possibly have painted like that. They are theatrical in the sense that they are working with the body. They are performative. And the act of producing and viewing the Black paintings has precisely that kind of performative drama. Souza's, there are a fair number of photographs of the artist taken by various photographers. But in each instance, there's this activation of pictorial surface with the body in the photographs.
Thank you. If I may, a couple questions about Souza's own kind of personal engagement in political and social theory and critique. Logan asked, could you talk more about Souza's interest or lack thereof in Marxism and the Communist Party? He disagreed with social realism, but seems to have ironically found some similarities in his own work. How does, quote, social realism figure into his artwork, as he somewhat referred in his own evaluations of his work?
Souza was a prolific writer, and he also provides a definition of social realism, which predictably is quite distinctly different from social realism as we understand it. But I also want to put into context Souza's complex relationship with the Communist Party and with Marxist thought. Remember that this is the time when many non-European, or rather many intellectuals of color are withdrawing from the Communist Party. This is the time when Césaire submits his resignation, withdrawing from the French Communist Party. And in his resignation letter, he writes that he writes, puts it quite wonderfully. He says that the Communist Party provides one sense of the universal, yet the universal has many particulars, and this vision of social utopia doesn't quite work in the former colonies. Souza's own conflicts with the Communist Party occurs fairly early in life, and these conflicts revolve around the question of what counts as socially engaged art. But if one follows Souza's career, he was not just a prolific artist, but he was also a prolific writer. And in his writings, it becomes very clear that the withdrawal from the Communist Party was not tantamount to a rejection of Marxism as such, but rather it was an insistence on arriving at an understanding of social revolution and a socialist society that Souza believed and others believed too. I can think of a host of artists who resigned all around this time with very similar concerns to figure out a way that to make communism work in a very different world. Remember that the former colonies were not industrialized in quite the same way as Europe or North America. In other words, there wasn't a working class and a proletariat in quite the same sense. Yet there was political consciousness, yet this political consciousness was not linked to the production of the figure of the worker. So all of these complicated intellectual entry points into Marxism and the Communist Party.
Thank you. So a question from Mary Francis. You illuminate so much for me about the ways that many critics then and now framing of abstraction presumes, quote, universality of vision. Was Souza as critically engaged with gender politics as he was with critiques of racism and the caste system?
No. No, Souza was quite the misogynist. But in a way, and this is not to make excuses for Souza, there is none. He was an irrevocable misogynist, someone who wrote such explicit letters to another artist in India that these letters had to be destroyed for fear that the younger children would end up reading them. So Souza was quite notorious for being patriarchal, for being a misogynist. But in a sense, gender doesn't quite seem to have figured in the intellectual climate of decolonization, especially in the 1960s. And I say this because even Fanon has a very complicated relationship with questions of gender. So in a sense, gender, on the one hand, becomes the site upon which to cast concepts of decolonization. But on the other hand, it also becomes an emblem of the marginalized subject. Or rather, the female figure becomes an emblem of the marginalized subject. And these two positions are not quite reconcilable. And it's truly impossible to do so. So no, Souza's engagement with gender is very messy.
Well, we have two more questions left, but I want to be conscious of your time and of Dr. Kataforis, of your time. Do we feel up to one or two more? All right. Well, one more about political movements. This is also from Logan. Could you explain more about the anti-alignment movement as a so-called third worldist movement was their purpose to oppose both the capitalist-oriented US-aligned nation states and the socialist-oriented USSR-aligned nation states of the time?
So the non-alignment was a consortium of initially it was about 30 newly decolonized nation states who come together to form a third front in the Cold War's bipolar division of power. So the non-aligned countries were neither affiliated with capitalism, aka the United States, but nor were they fully affiliated with the USSR. Instead, they wished to present themselves as a third front in the Cold War constellation. But of course, the political constellation of the non-alignment goes back several decades. In fact, precisely the same figures, the political leaders who come together in Bandung in 1955, and this is the Bandung Conference is believed to be the intellectual beginning of the Third World. The non-aligned movement, which shapes up in 1961, was its political counterpart, as it were. But these very same figures had already met in 1927 at a gathering of political leaders from the colonized countries, but also figures from the United States who were anti-capitalism, who were socialists, who were working with the civil rights movements, likewise from Britain, labor leaders, and so on. But this movement sort of gets ruptured by the Second World War and dissipates. So Bandung in 1955, in a sense, was a coming together once again, but this time the former colonies were independent. Does that answer your question?
I think so. And Logan can chime in also, but I believe so. Yeah, Logan says yes. So, and then our last question, just other than all of the expressions of gratitude that have been shared in the chat for your talk and for your answers to people's questions. Finally, Mary Frances asked, since you have practiced as both a faculty member and a curator, sometimes simultaneously, would you reflect a bit on your experiences working in both modes? And what advice would you give to early career art historians who are interested in both university and museum work?
Personally, I don't distinguish between curatorial work and intellectual work, because curatorial work is also a form of intellectual work, except that its modalities are quite different. Whereas in an academic text, one has access to words. A curatorial project, on the other hand, has to stand on the strength of images, and so the organizational structure, what is available to the curator, space, for instance, makes the two practices different. But in the end, I don't think that they're that sharply dissonant. Of course, we stand at a time when curators are moving towards the academy, and academics are moving towards the museum. And I think it's quite wonderful, and it can generate new ways of thinking about things. I have, for instance, taught several classes that have led to an exhibition. And so while these are not different, and these two domains are moving closer to each other, at least I think so, I think in the end, it's a very different way of constructing an argument. In a book or an essay, you can theorize through words, but in an exhibition, you cannot. You cannot fill the exhibition with text. So you have to find a different way of doing it. But it's really the same thing.
Well, thank you so much. We are so appreciative of you sharing your research and your time with us this evening.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Gupta.
Thank you for the wonderful questions, and it's been lovely.
Yes. We look forward to welcoming our audience back for another 2 lectures this spring, one in March and one in April. But for now, we thank you for being with us this evening again. And it was just such a pleasure, Dr. Gupta, to hear your talk, to think through this with you. And we all really, I think, gained a great appreciation for the complexity and importance of these paintings by Francis Newton Souza in their rich context that you have constructed for us. So thank you again.